So basically, it was an amazing adventure working fraud in Brazil. Like it's very, very challenging. I'm always learning. If I were to talk about all the types of fraud we have today, we'd be here for at least 5 hours. So I often said that if you, as a fraud professional, have never been beaten up by fraud, like you are definitely not prepared to work in this field.
Hello and welcome to Brazil is Not for Beginners. Today my guest is Rafa Lichtenecker. Rafa is VP of Operations at IDWall. He is a fraud specialist. He's a friend of mine, and I'm really excited for this conversation. Rafa, thanks so much for joining me.
Thank you very much for having me, Isaac.
So it's been tough to schedule this one. I think we had to reschedule it 3 times. You got dengue, but we're here.
Yes, very good.
So you have a really exciting career and you do some really interesting work. And I'm hoping that to start off, maybe you can introduce yourself, share a little bit about your background, and talk how you found fraud as a subject matter that you really wanted to invest in and be focused on.
First of all, again, thank you very much for inviting me. Very happy to meet you again. So I'm Rafa, Vice President of Operations at IDWall. For those who don't know, IDWall is an identity validation, onboarding, and risk management company centered on the user. So basically, my experience has always been in fraud, product and operations. Last week, I completed 14 years in the fraud and payment industry.
Wow.
Yeah,
Congratulations.
thank you very much.
Or sorry. I don't know if I should say congratulations or sorry, but either one, whichever one is more apt.
So basically, it was an amazing adventure working fraud in Brazil. Like it's very, very challenging. I'm always learning. And like my career began at Grupo in 2011, where I had my first opportunity to work as head of anti-fraud for Latin America. From there, I had the opportunity to work in some companies in the payment industry, such as Mercado Pago and SumUp. And before I do all, I worked as director of operations at Nomad, also covering the anti-fraud area.
That's a great trajectory. Those are some great fintech names in Latin America for those who aren't familiar. That's a really cool trajectory. So you said you started at Groupon and you ended up doing anti-fraud. What was it about fraud that was a calling to you?
At the time, I didn't know anything about fraud. That's the real truth. Like I was working in operation, and then I received a job description to work in risk management. I didn't know anything about that. The only thing that I know is that when I had my card cloned, that I had to reach out to my bank asking for a chargeback, right? So we are dealing with a lot of chargebacks, and then they asked Rafa, I know that you work with some queries, you are a good analytics person. Can you go here and understand what's going on? And then I remember that I had the financials information that was integrated in our data lake, tries to understand where the fraud was. So in each category, what kind of behavior we had, and then everything started from there, Isaac.
Very cool. It's unwrapping a puzzle every day, right?
Absolutely.
And the fraudsters are super innovative. I have a little bit of exposure to this in my day job, and I think it's really cool. I don't know if cool is the right word, but it's really interesting to solve these problems. And I want to hear some stories in a little bit. But can you give us like a basic primer on fraud to start things out? So, fraud 101, what is first party fraud, second party, third party? What are some of these things that people have maybe heard the term and they don't know what it means? Or for people that maybe haven't even heard the term, right? So they know their card got copied, the card got cloned.
Sure. So when we talk about fraud, the first thing we need to understand is that we are talking about an action that jeopardizes a good customer, right? So it can be financially or reputationally, and it includes like a bunch of fraud that can be like identity fraud, where the fraudster obtains your information by stealing your documents or by phishing. Then we have transactional fraud, as you said, which includes card cloning, brutal force attacks. Then we go to account takeover, where the customer hacks your account because he has access to your credentials, or even social engineering, right? So the thing is that if I were to talk about all the types of fraud we have today, we'd be here for at least 5 hours.
So can you talk a little bit about just to deconstruct it maybe in broader groups? So my understanding first party fraud is more about when I do something and it might be either friendly. So for instance, I don't recognize a charge on my credit card. and I dispute it, right? And so it's not really fraud, but it is, but then it moves into where I'm purposefully doing that. So I order something and pretend that I didn't get it, or I order something and say I didn't get it and do the chargeback, right? So something like that. Is that a correct definition of first party fraud?
Absolutely. You're correct. 100%.
And then third party fraud is more about when somebody takes my credentials and pretends to be me, right?
Absolutely. And then you don't recognize a transaction, and then you need to reach out to the bank, ask for a chargeback, and then the bank will send the information to the acquirer. The acquirer will go to the e-commerce, and the liability of the online transaction is to the marketplace, and then there's a process of dispute. So that's mainly how it works, Isaac.
And then I understand the other thing that's been happening more and more as fraud solutions, frankly, have gotten better is I don't know the right terminology for it, but phishing and scams, right? So ways of gaining access where people give you access without them realizing that they're giving it to you. So people might be pretending to be someone. Can you talk a little bit about this movement almost away from stealing identity? And I think that you used some terms there about a brute force attack or, account entry things, account takeover, things like that, but where it's permissioned more and more.
Sure, sure. Before that, I think it's funny and it's curious to say, like, I remember maybe 15 years ago when I had to open a bank account, right? So I remember that I had to go physically to the bank, right? Pass through those revolving gates, take your coins out of your pocket, right? It was so bureaucratic. Then, like, you would stand in line, it should be called by a bank clerk, sign doses of paper, and your account will take about like 5 days to open, right? So with the emergency of fintechs, we know that today you can like open a bank account in 2 or 5 minutes, right? So to do this, you fill in your personal information and you go through a know your customer process, which usually includes sending your selfie and your document. And then we have like identity solutions like IDWall, which will do the whole process of liveness, self-match, and background check process to verify that you are you, right? In this context, and talking about this evolution of fintechs, let's go to the fraud. So the account opening fraud happens when the fraudster has access to your information. So they enter your information and try to bypass the know your customer process. And then there are more archaic ways where they try to use the customer's photo, or there are more robust ones like synthetic is using 2D or 3D masks, or even worse, deep fakes. If he succeeds, he gets it in your account, and then you have a big problem, right? And then we have the transactional fraud side. When the customer is at the checkout of an e-commerce, like enter the card details, the expiry date, and has the purchase approved, right? Then we turn to fraud when the fraudster can hack the payment gateway and get the card details, or he can get the card information from the deep and dark web, or even he can manipulate the customer through social engineering to get this info. So in short, there are so many numbers of ways to obtain this data, and then he can make fraudulent purchase. That's in this scenario, it's so important for the merchant to have good transactional fraud tools and machine learned models to mitigate the scenario. I don't know if you're getting my points, right?
Absolutely, absolutely. No, makes perfect sense. This is an area that I would say I know enough to be dangerous. I don't know enough to be an expert, but I know enough to be dangerous. And I just want to make sure that we're unpacking it a little bit for people that are maybe a little bit less familiar. And also for my own edification to make sure that I'm getting some of the terminology right and using it correctly so that we're not falling down a tunnel that is too focused. And I think you were talking there about some of the customer points and some of the customer interactions and where fraud comes in. And so this is a bit of a broad question, but like, why does this matter to customers and businesses, and how does this apply to us? And so, things like chargebacks, things like this, why should we be concerned about it? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So, as I said, this has like a huge financial and exposure impact for companies and consumers, right? On the business side, if you are not prepared to mitigate fraud, really it can lead to the company going bankrupt. On the customer side, it can have a financial and reputational impact as well. So, imagine, for example, if a fraudster open an account with your information, Zach. After that, he will apply for a loan or a credit card. The disruption in this scenario is inevitable, right? So that's how it's so important to work with the correct tools to mitigate this kind of situation.
Right, and I think that the points that you shared at the beginning around the change in how you open a bank account and how we shop and how we do these things make it more important than ever, right? Because it's not 5 days. They're not double checking 5 minutes and an instant issuance of a virtual card that you get and that you can go shopping with right away. And so a fraudster that has details can make purchases, can do things, can move money before you even know that something is happening, and it can be quite dramatic in time. You hear stories, we're both in the fintech space, about how it is in some respect a sign of growth, right? When you get big enough as a fintech that fraudsters find you and start to hack you, like it's a bad thing that you're getting hacked, but you need to resolve it right away. But it also means that you've gotten to a certain scale. And then on the other side as well, the ideas of preventing it, right? And what is it that we can do to limit fraud, and how do we have to think about it in terms of managing that? So I think that it's a really interesting topic. And you talked a bit about some of the things, liveness and some of these other things. So there's a lot that happens in the background. Can you walk us through a few of those processes in a bit more detail? So take us through an online purchase. When I put my credit cards in, what's actually happening in the background? Who's being involved? What are the checks that are happening to ensure that something is going? And on the other side, on kind of an account registration or an account opening process, what happens there?
So when you talk about open an account, right, you need to register the information. And then the first thing that you need to know if the customer is the real customer, right? So there are a lot of types of fraud that can happen in this scenario. You can have like a fraudsters try to take a photo of Isaac, for example, and then try to bypass. That's why we have the liveness solution. The liveness solution is to identify if the customer is not a photo of Isaac, for example.
So am I blinking or am I moving?
Absolutely. Then we can have the background check, right? To identify if the information that Zach is telling is the real truth, because he can't write the information of another person, for example. There's a lot of background checks doing to see if you have legal issues or if you have debts in the government and this type of thing.
And that's all instant, right? It's all happening in the background at the same
Absolutely.
time. Yeah,
So
amazing.
then you need to send the documentation, but you need to identify if the documentation is from Slack, because currently we have softwares in Brazil, right? Or like you can go to the Google and say software to emulate a document. Then we have to identify if the document is real. Then we have like a team to do like a analysis, because in Brazil we have more than 300 types of documents. So it's very difficult to identify the good ones from the bad ones. And then you go to sell something. So you need to understand, okay, but it's doing the same device. This customer already, like this card is already trying to do purchase in another device, another IPs, or for example, this customer is involved with another customer, which we already identify as fraud. And then we have all this behavior and machine learning to identify, of course, in the background, if the customer is legitimate, right? So this is a little bit about how the things process in the anti-fraud world, Isaac.
Fascinating, really interesting. And I've heard it said that Brazil is not for beginners and fraud is especially a case there. So, can you talk a little bit about some of the uniqueness of fraud in Brazil?
Absolutely. So you know that
You're laughing. I want to hear some stories as well.
I will later, yes. So you know that in my anti-fraud experience, I've had experience working in Latin America countries and also understanding how fraud works in Europe and North America. And I remember once when I was talking to a head of anti-fraud in Europe of an e-commerce company, and she said to me, Rafa, it's crazy what you're going through in Brazil. I've never seen anything like it. I wish you the best of luck. And it was very funny because what makes fraud unique in Brazil is the immensity of types of fraud we have today, Isaac. Like I was telling before, from the simplest frauds, such as sell fraud, when the customer said, hey, my product didn't arrive, but actually he arrived. So he's trying to get this money from the bank, right? To the most complex, which in my view today are concentrate in onboarding, right? So with the advance of generative AI, fraudsters are now able to deepfake living or dead people and even create a new person, right? So when we look at this scenario, Today, like I said before, there is software that allows you to emulate the camera of an Android and circumvent process using the photo of a real document and self-manipulated with deepfake. So this is what we are having in Brazil, right? The fraud evolves so much that currently it's even challenging to defeat it, right? So this is a little bit about how the fraud is so unique in Brazil. And believe me, like we are, I don't know, 5, 6 steps from another countries in terms of this matter, Isaac.
Do you see Brazil as a reference for other markets? So one of the things we talked about, and we'll talk about a little bit later on, is the innovation in fintech and how Brazil is leading the way with things like Pix and the instant payments. But is this an area where Brazil is ahead? And are there things that other countries can learn from this? Are you seeing Brazilian companies like yourselves beginning to get called by companies outside of Brazil to support their fraud processes, to help them identify almost what's coming, right? Because it seems like Brazil is a leader in this for better and for worse.
Absolutely, 100%. Zach. In that, we are benchmarking in fraud industry, right? I remember the last time that I've seen the chargeback figures in the world, and I know that in Brazil and in Mexico, they have like the major chargeback rates in the world, right? But in Brazil, with this decrease of the fintechs, there are new types of fraud that in Mexico we don't have today, such as when I talk about 3D masks, when I'm talking about synthetic keys, identities, or the evolution of deepfake. So this makes unique in Brazil, and this is how Brazil can be and is a benchmark for another country. So I've already talked with a lot of companies in another countries that telling Rafa, please give me like a learning about this matter because what you have there, like I said, the head of fraud in Europe that talked with me, it's insane, right? So give me some times how to defeat that, right? So yes, 100% exactly.
Are these fraudsters, just to understand, are they Brazilians or are they, from other markets that are trying to tap Brazil for one reason or another? Where is the fraud coming from?
It comes from Brazilians, okay? Basically, they are always talking in the deep and dark web, right? So they are always trying to, like, there are a lot of curses in Brazil, how you open a fraudulent account, how to do that, how to steal someone. This is sad, but they are always talking in the deep and dark web, and they are talking which site it's better to attack first because the site doesn't have the proper anti-fraud tools or they don't have a constant know your customer process. So they are always talking. We do have attacks coming from Europe, but in the majority, they start in Brazil. Is like I'm pretty sure about that.
Okay, interesting that it's so big here and it shows, I think, a couple of things. One is, the capability of the country. How do we direct it towards good is maybe one of the questions. And the other one is one of the things we've talked about a lot is the use of social media and how quickly things spread in Brazil. And I think that Brazilians are very internet savvy, surprisingly so. And this is part of that. But you've mentioned at a high level some of these incidences you've seen. I don't know if you can share a couple stories with us that are particularly pertinent or just interesting and innovative and show the kind of ingenuity, for lack of a better word, that some of these fraudsters bring to this.
How many stories am I allowed to say? Because
As many as you want. Let's start with a couple and we'll go from there.
so I often said that if you, as a fraud professional, have never been beaten up by fraud, like you are definitely not prepared to work in this field. The first was when I started out in the world of fraud. I worked for an e-commerce company, and I remember that they made a release in the product and disregard our anti-fraud tool. It's considered our anti-fraud tool in this release. Like this happened on a Friday afternoon, which by the way is not the best date for release. But I remember that on Saturday morning, I went to look at the company's figures and saw that Friday sales had grown by 30% compared to the last Friday. 30% exactly, right?
Some people might sound that that's good.
Yeah, so the sales team was setting off fireworks, right? So wow, 30% more. And even not having any campaigns, 30% more, this is incredible, right? I remember that I went into my Antifraud tool and saw that there were no transactions going through it. So in a nutshell, all the sales, 100% of the sales were fraudulent. And that's how it happens, right? The fraudster has no hate for a company. He just goes where it is easiest. And when he finds that gap, the fraud happens very quickly, like an anthill, right? So that is how is the fraud world, right? There is another interesting story in another company I worked for. Like they were launching a digital bank. And I think that due to a lack of knowledge, the customer created an account only using a valid CPF, the identity personal number in Brazil, email, name, and date of birth. And I remember that the anti-fraud department was not asked to give an opinion on this launch. Okay. So it was a crucial mistake, right? So I remember that there were 2 days, like in one weekend, that the fraudsters created numerous accounts, generated a payment link, like within the bank, used cloned cars to monetize and cash out for another bank they had. So I remember that millions of Brazilian reais were lost. Unfortunately, we had to stop the bank's adoptions in order to work on a consistent know your customer solution, right? So I can like stay here tell you more stories. Like I said, if you didn't pass through it, you're not ready to work in the fraud industry.
Yeah, you need to take your lumps and
Yeah,
understand what's going on for sure. And you can't win them all, right? It's playing defense the entire time
yeah.
and just trying to stay ahead of them, which is really incredible. And you've talked a little bit about some of the, again, for lack of a better word, innovations in fraud and how AI is coming in with some of these deep fakes and digitally created masks. So it continues to be a major topic in a lot of segments and here in specific, but you've talked about some of the implications for what fraudsters are doing on their end. And I don't know if there's other things that you can share about that, but what are also some of the implications on the positive side in terms of how this is helping you? How is AI impacting fraud, both from a positive side as well as from kind of a negative side? So from the fraudsters as well as from your side in terms of IDWall or other companies that are trying to fight it.
So your question remind me of an AI video I saw a few weeks ago showing Will Smith eating spaghetti. I don't know if you've seen that.
I heard about it.
The video, which was made in 2023, where the images are very funny and distorted. And then today, 2 years after that, it's extremely difficult to tell that the video was made by AI. And this, just to let you know the evolution of AI, this is very, very interesting to see. So, summing up, there are many impacts when we talk about AI, which translate into efficiency gains for people and companies. And there is also the positive impact for the fraud world when you talk about refining the understanding of the customer behavior, Isaac. But unfortunately, the downside is that AI has brought additional complexity in identifying good customers from bad ones, right? So
Yeah.
with generative AI, deepfakes are becoming more and more real. So in the onboarding of IDWall that I do with new employees arrive here, like we do some tests where we put like some real people against images made by deepfakes. And believe me, they like invariably get it wrong and assume that the deepfake image is of a real customer and the photo of the real customer is the false one, you know? So just to give a proper example about how difficult it is to identify and getting
And getting
harder. Yeah,
harder.
yeah, that's it.
No, amazing. So maybe thinking a little bit more practically, if you don't mind, kind of what is some advice that you can share that would be helpful? So what are some of the common mistakes that you see companies making? Are there some common beliefs and practices in terms of onboarding and, payment acceptance that are mistaken? And what are some basic best practices that companies should implement?
Isaac, before I answer your question, I think it's important to highlight 2 figures that McKinsey reported in 2024. So the first says that 32% of Brazilian companies had losses of more than 10% of EBITDA coming from fraud. And the second says that 62% of companies believe they could have avoided up to 30% of current fraud losses, right? The main mistake companies make is thinking about building a risk of anti-fraud department when the fraud problem has already started. Okay, this is by far the biggest mistake. Like
Okay.
the chargeback going up, and then say, "Oh, okay, let's try to talk with someone who understands the problem of fraud." Right. So then it went a lot of chargebacks, impacted the margin, impacted the EBITDA. Right. When we are thinking about an e-commerce company or a new fintech, it's essential to talk to companies such as IDWall, like we checked as a trusted advisor to help with the pillars of how to protect your company financially, right? So I think this is the main mistake. Like if the people will think about fraud only when it starts to happen, and then they already passed for a lot of fraud losses, and then the company will have a big problem.
What are some common beliefs that people have about some of this fraud? So you mentioned that 62% of the companies thought they could have prevented it. So what are some things that maybe companies think that they're doing right, but they aren't right now?
The first thing is that like I'm gonna create a company and then I need to grow this company and I need to grow this company faster and I need to bring revenue. But this company is not looking the side effect of this growth. Like sometimes they don't know that there are fraud happening and there are fraudsters trying to attack this company, right? Like sometimes you identify only when the acquirer or the scheme goes to reach out to the company and say, hey, your chargeback is up to 2%, 3%. Like you need to do something. Otherwise, like we are not going to be able to process MasterCard or Visa or etc. Right? The point here is that when you start a company or a fintech or an e-commerce, you need to do a risk assessment to understand which kind of contracts you need to have, you know? So this is the main important thing.
Understood. And within that risk assessment, what are some of the basic things? And, feel free to pitch IDWall if you'd like. It's a great company, proudly Brazilian for sure. But what are some of the like basic things that you recommend any company do right off the bat? So obviously there's more advanced things and everybody can turn the needle as far as they want in terms of their fraud protection and the degrees to which they want it. And as we've discussed, fraud is inevitable, right? It's part of business and you can have zero fraud if you have zero sales. If you're going to have sales, you're going to have a little bit and you need to manage for it. But what are some of the kind of basic 101 things that you think any company should do? So you mentioned here this idea of a risk assessment. Like what's part of that and what comes after that as these first initial, steps one, two, three?
I would say, first of all, try to understand. For example, if I'm talking about an e-commerce company, I'm gonna try to, I don't know, sell notebooks, for example. So the first thing is to understand which kind of information I need to receive. After that, I need to understand, of course, how it's gonna be the onboarding process of this company. So if we are talking about a fintech, if we are talking about a company who will offer a credit card, for example, you need to have a consistent loyal customer, for example, right? So you need to have a document, you need to have a selfie, you need to go through a liveness, and you need to run a background check. So for each category, there is an assessment that you need to do, you know, Isaac. And then when you talk about doing an online purchase, you need to have at first guardrail of rules and fraud tools. I'm not telling that you need to have a robust machine learning to detect this fraud. I'm just telling that you need to do a guardrail of rules, something that you cannot have five purchase doing in the last 2 minutes in the same purchase. It looks weird, right? So it's kind of guardrail of rules to protect yourself, you know? So it depends of each category, but mainly some examples that I would like to say is basically the thing that the business needs to do.
Understood. So you talked a bit there about some of the basic things that companies need to have in mind as they're doing their KYC, as they're doing their account opening, building in the basic guardrails. What advice do you have specifically for foreign companies that are looking at Brazil? So it might be a foreign e-commerce company, it might be a neobank or a bank that's entering Brazil. It might be just somebody doing business and selling to Brazilians. How should they think about fraud? And what are some of the things that you would offer as basic information? We were talking before the call, things like installment payments, which are so common in Brazil and are different outside. So, how should foreign companies in particular think about navigating Brazil? Other, of course, than maybe contracting IDWall, but what are some of the things that they can do to protect themselves, but also maybe more so, kind of what are the things that they should be aware of?
I think that the first thing is to understand, of course, the local payments that we have in Brazil, right? For example, Pix is definitely a secure payment method. Definitely, right? It's the best evolution in terms of payments that we had in, or perhaps in centuries, right? So the thing is that in Brazil, we have a lot of robber. We are talking about insecurity, and then we are talking about instant payment, and then your cell phone can be still, and then he can go to your bank account and then do a misappropriation using Pix, right? So you need to understand which kind of contracts you need to have there, right? So for example, Let's try to understand the device of the customer. So if he's trying to do a cash out in a unsecure city or neighborhood, you can have this kind of controls to identify if it's fraud or not, right?
Yeah.
And that, when you talk about credit card, you're talking about a lot of fraud. And then which kind of rules you need to identify to mitigate fraud when you talk about credit card, right? I think that the main advice is to understand basically which are the main payment methods in Brazil and understand the vulnerability that we had using each kind of payment method.
Yeah, I think this comes back to what we talked about at the beginning, and that's one of the reasons I brought it up in terms of I think there's probably, if I'm correct, less actual account takeover, brute force attacks. There's more security within the payment system, but there's a growing amount of phishing and scams to have access to people's accounts. So I think the nature of fraud, and you and I have talked about this a little bit, has changed in a lot of ways, right? So if you're a company, if you're a bank, your payments are secured, you need to monitor, you need to do all these different things, but it seems like more and more of the discussion and the practices are around educating your consumers and your businesses about how to protect themselves from fraudsters and scammers trying to gain access through manipulation and through some of this social engineering, I think was the term you used before, right?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. That's it.
Amazing. I got something right.
Yes.
So I know we've been going for a while here. I just wanted to ask you, and I brought this up earlier as well. Brazil is really known for this innovation in financial services. Nubank, the other banks, Inter, Neon, these other kind of emerging PicPay, fintechs, Pix and Drex coming. This innovation is driving the speed of payment. It's driving the expectations that consumers have. And Brazil is being known for this. And I'm wondering how that's driven innovation and fraud and digital identities. And really kind of what are the implications of innovation in other segments on fraud? One of the things we were talking about earlier was things like provenance, right? So how is innovation in not just in the financial system, and I do want to hear about that, but like innovation in agriculture? You've got a new type of organic food. How do we maintain provenance over that as well? So how is innovation in other segments driving innovation in fraud and identity?
Well, very good question. Going back to the past, Isaac, remember that we had frauds in the fiscal world with a swing swipe. So you had to pass through that, and you have a swing swap, and then it goes to the ship and pin to mitigate fraud, right? So then the fraud started in online transactions, and we had like more robust fraud tools and machine learning models to mitigate this kind of process. And then we have Pix, and like I said, Pix has a secure payment method, but that is the insecurity of Brazil, who is a lot of use cases of fraud, right? So then we had the advance of fintechs, and that we need to take care about the know your customer process, right? And with generative AI, we're talking about deep fakes and how difficult it is to identify the good customer from the bad ones, right? So the thing is that when you have this innovation, and we have a lot in Brazil, the fraudsters is always going to find a way to test and try to do something wrong, and that's because the return of investment works. So that's he's always trying to find new ways to defraud. I've always said to my friend, hey guys, the risk professional will never end. It's like, okay, but we have the generative AI, and then we have a lot of things that is improving the efficiency. But the thing is that the professional who works in that fraud will always exist because the innovation will grow up, and then it grows the fraud trying new ways to defraud. So basically it's the way that I think about it.
If these fraudsters could direct their activities and energy to positive things, it would be amazing what we could achieve, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
This has been really great. I've really enjoyed this. It's been really educative and interesting for me. But I always like to ask at the end of these conversations what the expression Brazil is not for beginners means to you.
Right. So Brazil is not for beginnings for a number of reasons. But since we are talking about the word of fraud, like I said, Brazil has more than 350 different types of documents. It makes differentiating between good and bad customers even more difficult. So that's the way I translate Brazil is not for beginnings, considering what we are talking about today.
Yeah, just the complexity and the bureaucracy that you deal with here. It is a lot for sure. The other thing I always like to ask people on this conversation is if there's any Brazilian habits or traits or expressions that they really like that foreigners might like. And one that I learned recently that I really enjoy, my daughter eats really well. And somebody said, Ela é bom de garfo. She's good with a fork. And I really like that expression.
That is an expression I love. It says, vamos fazer de limão uma limonada. So basically, it means making the best of a difficult or adverse situation, right? So perhaps it's the expression that I use the most in my days, right? I don't know if it's a common expression in Brazil or other countries, but it's the main expression that I use in Brazil.
Yeah, it's definitely common in the US, and I imagine is par for the course in the fraud profession because you're constantly dealing with lemons that you need to turn into lemonade. So I'm glad you're fighting the good fight. But Rafa, like I said, this was really great. I really appreciate all the time. A lot of fun. How can people reach you? So if people want to dive into fraud, if they want to learn more about things going on in Brazil, if they want to learn about IDWall and some of the services that you offer specifically, how can people reach you?
Sure. In IDWall, we have like our main page in LinkedIn. You can just search for IDWall.
Yep.
And I think the main way to find me is through LinkedIn as well. So Rafael Lichtenecker. I know that it's not a common surname. I know that. The things that I really enjoy interacting with people and learning from them. So just give me a ping and I will be happy to chat with you guys. So again, Isaac, it was a pleasure to talk with you. And sorry about the 3 delays, right? The tour guide postponed that, but it was great to have you and to talk about fraud industry with you.
No, this is a topic that I was really interested in diving into. It's something that people have asked me about being in, payments and fintech, obviously. This is a topic that is near and dear and that people have said, Brazil is known for it. So I'm glad we made this work. Hafa, thanks so much for coming on. And thanks everybody for listening. Thanks again for joining us. This podcast was hosted by me, Isaac Matzner. It was produced and edited by Maria Filmis. You can find more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and YouTube, as well as on our Substack page. We do love feedback, so please feel free to reach out to us on social media or via email at Brazil, 4, beginners@gmail.com.